We first came to the lake in 1939, and really we didn't stay at the camp then because the buildings weren't all finished, and they were more concentrating on I think using some of the senior campers and staff as helpers in the construction process for the first year or two. And my memories back then are very vague because I was only 6. That was something that we really didn't really know that much of what was happening as far as anything like that went on, because his participation in the camp was more behind the scenes. First of all, because he was a busy guy in his work, and so he wasn't able to be there as much as the rest of the directors because they were all school teachers. So they had, and that was the reason that they got together and got the camp going, because they, being school teachers, they were unemployed during the summertime back then, and so they wanted to do something that would involve kids and give them a place for their families to spend the summer. Those are some of the things I remember about his time. And I know when he used to come, at least once a season, he'd bring up all kinds of fruit. He'd come up with his vehicle just loaded down with fruit and ice cream, and they had there was an annual fruit party at the camp, and all of the staff would turn up, all the councillors and the trippers, and the kids didn't get in on that one, but that was a famous thing because everybody used to overeat on the fruit because it was kind of so rare that in those days you only got seasonal fruit when it was available. In the beginning, back in the early days of the camp, back in the 30s and late 30s and early 40s, there really wasn't much development as far as cottage development on any of the lakes around, and I think that was one of the reasons that this site was chosen, because we were basically in the wilderness. There at that time there was only in the beginning there was only 3 other cottages on the whole lake, on the lower lake. We were still in the wilderness as far as the kids were concerned. You didn't see any boats. There was no motors on the lake. It was quiet and peaceful. And the kids got the feeling that we were right out in the wilderness. And when we went over into Shabamika or Buck Lake or Dyer to camp, it was like going into another world. I mean, there was nobody around, and it was great. Canoe tripping was great. It was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of good experiences out on the trips. That was sort of balanced off with the weekend activities at the camp, because practically everybody came back for the weekends from their trips. I mean, the camp was virtually abandoned during the week. Everybody was gone. There was just the staff, just the directors were there, and the kitchen staff and the other people that were around, because we were all off on our canoe trips, and so they had some time off during the week. They had to do most of their work on the weekends when we were all back. When the weekend activities were pretty good, because there was the Grand Council, and there was a regatta every Sunday, either a swimming regatta or a canoeing regatta, and those competitions were really a lot of fun. There was a lot of rivalry between the kids in the camp because of the division into the 2 tribes that they had. Everybody at the camp needed to learn to swim, and that was one of the main criteria. Was your minimum qualifications to go in a canoe. In the beginning, when everybody didn't canoe, they used to have pointers and punts, old flat bottom rowboats that they used for the smaller kids at the camp. And the pointers were made locally, I think up around Renfrew somewhere. And they were versions of the old logging boats that they used to use. And the whole cabin group would go on a trip in one of the pointers, and they'd paddle up the lake just like a bunch of Norsemen, I guess you might say, and they'd paddle up and camp on one of the campsites that was there. In order to go in one of those boats, you had to be able to swim 25 yards. That was the basic criteria for swimming at the camp, and some of the kids had trouble getting that far, and there were always usually incentives for it. But the big incentive was the fact that you were holding up your group if you were the only one in the cabin that couldn't swim. And so everybody would cheer along the ones that were attempting to qualify. And there was a 25-yard qualification for canoe, or for the rowboats and the pointers, and there was a 50-yard requirement for being alone in a canoe, and then there was even, I think it was 100 yards for sailboats. So there were carrots at the end for the achievement, because you got to do some of the other things in the camp that you couldn't do if you couldn't make it. So the camp was pretty well geared to outdoors and all things outdoors, really, because we were involved in fire lighting and campfire lighting, really, and cooking over open fires and building shelters and so I think a lot of the things, although they weren't something that people would necessarily use when they grew up, there was a lot of skill practice which gave the kids competence, a feeling of, that they were able to achieve things, so that they, when other challenges would come up later on in their life, they wouldn't be afraid to try them out, because they'd been successful at doing things as a kid. So that was fairly important, I think. One of the basic ideas of the camp was to encourage the kids to try things and learn. It was just like being a big kid, a big camper, really, except that you had responsibilities that you had to do as a counselor, and you were, I think, encouraged to show a little maturity, even though we were still only, for the most part, teenagers. You were given the responsibility of having these kids to look after, and you were supervised, of course, by the directors and given all the help that they could give you. There were other duties rather than just looking after the day-to-day stuff. They had what they called night watch, and this is when we were in camp. The counselors, of course, were expected to have some time off eventually, so usually what they called night watch came in on the night before your day off, and there were two shifts. One shift that went till midnight, the other one that went to 6 in the morning, and you would be up, and once every hour you would walk around all the various sleeping cabins where the kids were staying, check them over. So the kids were looked at every night, every hour, to make sure that everything was okay and the kids were safe. And those that required watering were watered or dewatering. Because with small kids, of course, some of them had problems that way, but and some of the kids were nervous, and you would find that they'd thrown off their covers at night, so you'd cover them back up again. So there was always somebody checking every hour on the kids. I met him several times. Usually it was met him on the trails over there on his property, and he wanted to know who the heck we were, landing on his beach, you know, and we were always a little hesitant about pulling up to the beach or getting out of the canoes on the beach because we figured Merrill would come and chase us off. We always thought of him as a bit of a grump, but once you got to know him, he seemed to be a fairly decent chap. We used to spend a lot of time scampering around on the rock. There was still, in those days, access up where the old stairwell or the old steel staircase went. That now it wasn't safe enough to use, but there was a fairly easy way, as far as we were concerned, to get us up to the top. And one of the thrills, I guess, that the kids at the camp had was climbing up to the rock and looking out over the lake. For the sake of competition, I guess you might say, the camp was divided down the middle into two tribes. Each cabin group was actually divided into the two major tribes, and this was the Algonquins and the Iroquois, because being a canoeing camp, it sort of tied together with Indian life, and the camping that we were doing was sort of, you might say, tied into the way the Indians used to survive. So the camp was divided into Algonquins and Iroquois as the two major tribal groups, and then each cabin group chose a name of an Indian tribe, like the Arapaho or the Sioux or whatever, and they had their own council or their own fire circle at their cabin. Usually it was every other Saturday night, I guess, that we had the Grand Council, which was done at a cleared circle back in the woods behind the camp, which was set up like a small amphitheater. The cabin groups would dress up in their Indian regalia. The directors of the camp, who were the chiefs, that would come, and it was all done in a replica of a Plains Indian Grand Council. And of course, the chiefs were all dressed in Indian regalia, including full-length war bonnets and Indian blankets that they wore over their shoulders, and it was done in a very somber way. The first part of the evening was an educational type of evening where the Grand Council would be geared towards Indian traditions, and they would have a fire lighting ceremony, and they would have a portion of the Grand Council that was what they referred to as ranger reports, where the kids on the canoes would report on things that they'd seen and done when they were off on canoe trips. And it was very impressive to the smaller kids, because it was, in their mind, so Indian. Usually one of the chiefs would give a talk, sort of I guess you'd call it a inspirational message that he would give, usually just prior to the Grand Council coming to a close, and everybody would gradually, quietly move themselves back to their own campsite, and that would happen every other week. Now, and then in the interim weeks, they would have what they called music hall night. There would be some sort of entertainment in the lodge at the camp. Sometimes films, sometimes skit nights. It was very popular. Yeah, they had everything was more or less had a background to it, an Indian type background to it. Even the individual awards for the campers, achievement awards at the end of the summer. They would keep track of the various things that the kids had achieved during the summertime, and if you achieved up to a certain level, you would qualify for an Arrowhead Award, and the Arrowhead Award was something that was really sought after, because that was not only based on your achievements, but on your counselor's view of how you made out with the other kids in the group. Outstanding achievements were recognized by arrowheads, and these were actual Indian arrowheads that they had gotten from, I'm not just sure where, but out west somewhere, along with all the Indian regalia that the chiefs wore. But these arrowheads were mounted on cross sections of a birch, and had inscriptions on the birch, and it was they were all painted and finished. And these were highly sought after by the campers. The major award for the campers that did the very best achievement at the camp was a paddle, and these paddles were decorated and given as one was given away each year to the most outstanding camper at the camp. So they were highly sought after. So everything was sort of geared towards the Indian aspect of the camp, and when they brought in guests to speak to the camp, or to put on a session, such as, well, I remember one time they brought Still Apps in, who was quite a famous hockey player at the time, and they brought him in for a session, and he brought. Everybody went up to the Grand Council area in the daylight. This was one of the only times that ever happened. We all went up there, and Mr. Apps gave us quite a session on sportsmanship and the role it played in hockey for him. And of course, he was a hero. That was quite an experience for a lot of the kids. They remember that for years. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I can remember Fred quite well, because he did an awful lot of very good work for the camp, and manufactured all the dining room tables, and there were quite a few very interesting carvings that he did that are quite sought after. Or would be quite sought after if they went on the open market, but I think they reside in some of the ex-directors' families that treasure them, and they wouldn't let them go for anything. But yeah, Fred did a lot of that, and as a matter of fact, he did quite a bit of painting up in this area as well, which was quite well received. You'd almost say that he was the eighth man in the group of seven, almost, because he was he traveled and did not just in this area, but he did an awful lot of the same type of landscapes and kind of work that most of the group of seven were famous for. He also was at Pickering College for quite some time. Yeah, the old Thunderbird that sat over the fireplace in the camp, and there were big plaques that represented various forms of pioneer life that also decorated the main lodge there. It was quite an impressive place, actually, for years and years. The camp served a great purpose for a lot of kids. In the 50 or so years that it ran, they certainly had a lot of kids learn a lot about life that I think was a very, very valuable experience for many of them. And I think that there are an awful lot of people that have a lot of good memories of the camp and the lake and the surrounding area.